Happy Easter. Today I want to address the question that everybody at some point in life has asked. In fact, I think it's a great question to address on this day. This is maybe the perfect day of the entire year to address this question. How do we get into heaven? This is a question that most Americans have asked at some point, because the majority of Americans, I think it's overwhelmingly majority, it's over 90%, believe that there's some kind of afterlife, believe in some form of heaven. And I would assume that you're here today, and part of you being here today is representative of how you feel, that there's something after this life. So how do you get into heaven? I don't know if you've heard the one about the Sunday school teacher that was teaching the second grade class, and they were asking this question. He was kind of quizzing them, poking at them, said, "Hey, let me ask you kids, how do you get into heaven?" He said, let's say that I lived my whole life doing good deeds for other people. Would that get me into heaven? The kids all go, no, 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 no. He goes, all right, what if I give all my money away to help out widows and orphans and the poor? Would that get me into heaven? The kids are like, no, 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 no. He said, oh, okay, I got one for you. What if I spent my whole life being kind to animals, little puppies and kitty cats, and gave every kid in the world candy? Would that get me into heaven? They go, no, that's not it. He goes, well, what is it, kids? What do you have to do to get into heaven? And they go, well, you got to be dead. Right? Which is very true. That's a very good point. I tested that one out on my kids this weekend, and they were like, that is a real dad joke, Dad. And I'm like, well, that's all I got at this point in life. So I think this is obviously, it's a very important question, and it's a question that we've all wrestled with at different points in life. And I also recognize that the idea that today, that maybe if you're even curious about that question, or you have thoughts about that question, or maybe you have some skepticism or some questions yourself about that question, I recognize that most of you, you're probably here today because you came with someone, maybe your family, this is part of your tradition. Maybe you call Crossroads your church. Maybe it's been a while since you've been here. Maybe it hasn't been a while. Maybe you come every single week. But it's hard to fathom that somebody would change their entire worldview, or would even be open to an entirely new idea, maybe a different than what you may have thought before, particularly on a day that's such a, yes, it's a important day for the church. It's a cultural day of importance. It's obviously a religious holiday. And I get that this might not be the day where you would open your mind up, open your heart up to the answer, what might be the answer to that question. But I would just encourage you to do that for the next few minutes. Let's just try to have a real conversation. Let's try to put all the busyness of the Easter season, of maybe what you didn't do before you left home, or what you forgot to do, or what you got coming up later today. And if we could just be really present in this moment to ask that question, well, what does one have to do to get into heaven? I think this is the perfect place, a perfect time to ask this question, because obviously you're here today, or you're watching online today, but there's a lot of people in the building today. And there's something in you that believes God has something to say about this. That God has something to do with who gets to experience heaven and who doesn't. Eternity is a pretty important concept. That as big a deal as this life is, that this life is small. The dash between when we're born and when we die is very small compared to the vastness, the never-ending other side of this life. And so maybe a better way to say it, a more technical way to say it, certainly a more specific way to say it, would be to ask this question. What does it take to be in right standing with God? What does it take to be in right standing with God? Who doesn't want to be in right standing with God? Most people would say, yeah, I don't want to be on the opposite side. I don't want to be in God's bad graces. I don't want to be on the wrong side of God. Well, what does it take? What does it take to be in right standing with God? I think that the answer to the question is really the same answer of what does it take to get into heaven. Most people would say, if you were to just go out on the street, person on the street asking questions, maybe put a microphone in the face, hey, real quick, what does it take to be in right standing with God? They would say, well, you have to do a lot of good, right? You got to do good. You got to do a good bit of good. In fact, you got to do more good than you do bad. Maybe they would say, well, I think what I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to stack up all my good and hope that it outweighs all my bad. Well, we can't do good all the time. We wish we could do good all the time. Some of you are even hoping that maybe you were gooder, that you were less bad, that you had more good than you do bad. But all of us have tried that. We've tried that math, right? Of thinking, well, if God's watching, if God cares about the way I live, then certainly when I stand at the end of my life in judgment of my life, I'm hoping that there will be more good than there is bad, right? Has that ever bothered anybody? I mean, this is American theology. There is a God, he wants me to do more good than the bad that I've done. That's the way most people believe. But has that ever bothered you? Has it ever bothered you trying to figure out, well, what is good and what is not good? Because we can't even agree on it. Some of us have different thoughts on it, different opinions on it, but certainly, historically, the marker has changed. Historically, the bullseye has changed. I mean, there was a time in the not so distant past where people thought, the general public just thought, oh, certain people have more value than other people. And then now, we stand at a point in time which I really appreciate what we believe, that we believe, no, every person, no matter if it's a person that is from America or a person that's not, no matter their skin color, no matter what religion they speak, no matter how much money they have, no matter if it's a female or a male, every person has transcendent value. Every person has value. That's something that we hold to be true, but there was a day where people didn't see that. People didn't believe that. The overwhelming majority thought, no, men just have more value than women. Or slave owners have more value than slaves. Or people from certain nations, or people with certain economic status, or people that spoke certain languages have certain value over others. And so we would look back and go, well, I certainly hope that if God is going to judge good, that God is going to give some kind of grace to people from the past because they were wrong about a lot of things. But even today, there's differences in opinion about what is good and what is not good. And some of you were born into a good family. Some of you were born into a family where there was a high moral ethic. And so you just knew right from wrong. And you were predisposed to do right more than you were to do wrong. And then some of you were born in a home where there was no morality. You do whatever is right in your own eye. You do whatever you need to do. You handle yourself however you need to handle yourself. And now you look back and you go, I didn't know. I can't be held accountable for what I knew and what I didn't know. Hey, let me ask you, what age do we start counting? I got little kids, and I'm telling you, these kids, I'm pretty confident, have done more bad than they have done good. All of them. Because they just come out of the womb doing stuff that ain't right. And I'm like, somebody better raise these kids, give them some home training, or else they are in some trouble if the name of the game is stack up all your good against all your bad. No, do you ever get frustrated with it? Sometimes I feel like, well, if that's the case, if that's what we believe, that to be in right standing with God, we've got to just do more good than we've done bad. God's not a very good God. God's like a teacher that's going, hey, we're going to have a pop quiz coming up. I'm not going to tell you when it is. I'm not going to tell you what's going to be on it. And I'm not going to tell you what you're responsible to know. Get ready, have fun. Hope you enjoy this class. Right? I mean, that would be terrible. My wife's always doing some kind of workout routine. She's always doing like some 30-day thing, some 21-day thing, some 14-day thing, some 45-day thing, some 75-day thing. And she always asks me, she's like, hey, you want to join this thing that I'm doing? And my first question is always, when does it end? I don't care about when it begins. I want to know, when is it over? And if we're going to be watching some video of somebody doing some exercise that we're supposed to be doing, I want to know, how many more do we have? How much longer do we have? And what time am I going to get to take a break? Because I'm already tired just watching it. Right? You ever feel that way? But how miserable is it if somebody's like, hey, let's go on a run, let's go on a jog, let's do this workout, and they don't tell you when it ends, and they don't tell you how you're going to be graded, and they don't tell you how you're going to be measured, and they don't tell you how long you're going to be doing it. That would be horrible of God to go, hey, just do more good than you've done bad. But he hasn't given us a specific list of what's good and what's bad. I like to mess with people sometimes because people will be like, after I have this conversation, they'll be like, well, it's the 10 Commandments. That's what it is. And I'll be like, well, aren't you smart? All right, then, can you name the 10 Commandments? And they're like, no, but I'm just living by them. I'm like, you don't even know them and you living by them? Like, that's crazy. You know what I'm saying? I'm telling you, this is a difficult question. And if the answer is to be in right standing with God, we got to do more good than we've done bad, it's a terrible proposition for us. Let me give you another option that people might say. In fact, some of you, you're here today because you would say it. Some of you would go, well, God, I assume God likes religion, and so I should just be more religious. That's what I got to do. To be in right standing with God, I got to just be more religious. And some of you, that's why you're here. You're here because you're going, this is my duty. This is what I got to do. I'm just here because I'm trying to be more religious. It's all about, do you go to church? Do you read your Bible? Do you pray? Do you say your Hail Marys? Whatever it is that your faith stream asks you to do, a lot of people would say you just be more religious. You know, when Jesus stepped on the scene, he was talking to a group of people. The Jewish people were very religious. That they did a lot of religious things. That they had a code of ethic. They had a list of good things that you were supposed to do that was far more specific than we could ever even imagine. In fact, I want to, if you got a Bible, you can turn here. This is probably, Crossroads, we're probably going to be the only church in the world that's going to say, Happy Easter, Easter Sunday. We're going to look at Leviticus 16. But I want you to just look for 1 second. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I don't want to lose anybody, right? How many of you have done a read through the Bible program in a year and then you quit about Leviticus? You know what I mean? Some of you were like, is Leviticus Hebrew for I'm done? Because that's usually when I get done with the Bible reading program. I mean, it's not easy to read. This is thick stuff. This is heavy stuff. And chapter 16 of Leviticus, the whole chapter, I mean, in my Bible, it's all of this page and it's all of this page. And these words are small. And the whole chapter is about this day of atonement. You know what atonement means? Atonement means, what are you going to do to pay for your sin? What are you going to do to take care of all the wrong that you've done? And God speaks to Moses and speaks to Aaron and gives them explicit instruction, detailed instruction, exhaustive instruction on what they're supposed to do on the Day of Atonement. Let me just read you just a couple snippets from it. This is how Aaron is to enter the sanctuary, God says, with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Now that's just for him and his family. But he's also to put on this sacred linen tunic and the linen undergarments next to his body, and he's to tie the linen sash around him and put on the linen turban. So there's like a whole outfit that he's supposed to wear. Some of you got it on today. And these are your sacred garments. And so he must bathe himself with water, which I'm like, what else is he bathing himself with? But nonetheless, before he even puts them on, from the Israelite community, he's to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram. So he's to do one for his family, 2 goats, a ram, and a whatever the other kind would be, 2 male goats, 1 for a sin offering and 1 for a burnt offering for his family. But then he's to do 2 more for the whole community. And then check this out. He's to offer the bull for his own sin, offering to make atonement for himself and his household. And then he's to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord. And he's supposed to cast lots for the 2 goats. And one of them is going to get sacrificed. And one of them is going to be, they're going to dip this little ring of cloth in blood, signifying all the sin that the community had done that year. And then they're going to put it on the other goat, the goat who lives, but don't be thinking, oh, congratulations, you got to live. No. This goat is known as scapegoat. You ever heard that term? You know, some of you are like, oh, I didn't really do it, but they pinned it on me because I was the scapegoat, right? I was saving everyone else. They put all the sin on me, and they would cast this goat out. And this goat would try to come back home, and they'd be like, no, dog, you out. You are gone, out. And so eventually they would pray that the goat would go out into the wilderness, and then eventually they would say the only way we can ensure that the right thing happens is they would go to the edge of a cliff, and they would push the goat off the cliff, because this goat is carrying the sin of all the people to atone for their entire year. I'm telling you, you thought it was particular, the instructions that your grandmama or your mama gave you about today? No, this was so tense for them. They had to get it just right because they were so religious. Coming to church a little bit, it's nothing compared to all that they would do. You could keep reading. We could read the whole chapter. It's exhausting. It's remarkable. It's kind of stunning what they do. But at the very end, verse 34, this is to be a lasting ordinance for you. Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites. And it was done as the Lord commanded Moses to do. They did it every year. Every year they had the Day of Atonement. They were careful about it. They were thoughtful about it. They were particular about it. Had to be exhausting. Had to be so tiring for them, knowing that this is the way that we're going to take away our guilt. And then the Apostle Paul comes on the scene, one of Jesus' closest followers. He wasn't one of the disciples, but he became one of the apostles because of his conversion later in his life. He wrote so many of the letters that we hold in our Bible. And one of them he wrote to the church in Rome, to the Christians that were scattered throughout Rome. We call it Romans. And in Romans 3, he comes along and he says this, maybe you've heard this before, that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. He's going, even your Day of Atonement, it doesn't work. Everybody gasped. He's going, even your religious practices, they don't work because God is a holy, perfect God. And before him, we stand guilty. And I know that's a dangerous accusation to make. And I'm not saying you all, I'm saying we all of us. We stand guilty. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. People will tell you, they'll say, anybody that tries to make you feel guilty, you ignore them. And I get it, because an inordinate amount of guilt is not a healthy way to live. But at the same time, if the standard that God has for us is perfection, Jesus comes on the scene and he says, be good and do good. You remember this rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, well, you first obey all the commandments. And he says, I've been doing it ever since I was a little kid. He said, secondly, go give away all your money to the poor. And he's like, I can't do it. And he left sad, right? Because the standard is so high. The law itself, the authors of the New Testament tell us that the law itself, everything we have in the Old Testament, all the 600 and something laws that we have from the Old Testament, the New Testament authors tell us the point of all those is to condemn us, to let us know we're guilty. Nobody can keep it all. Nobody can do it all. No, the standard that he has, it's just too high. And so I believe, yes, we stand guilty. I believe you stand guilty in front of a perfect and holy God. And so I don't know what your strategy is. To just try harder? To just do more? To do more good deeds? To try to be religious? I mean, think about it. As a pastor, religious leaders have used both of these for centuries to motivate people because they're very motivating. Some of you, you're more generous with your money. You're better with your behavior because you believe that the system is stack up good more than you're bad. Some of you, it's the reason why you participate in church or in religion, and religious leaders have leveraged both of these to keep people moral and to keep people engaged in the church. But I'm here today to tell you that neither one of those work. They don't work. If the goal is just be more good, then you are bad. If the goal is just to be more religious, it doesn't work, and we know it. We all know it because it's left up to what I can do. We've been looking at these words of Jesus, some of the last statements, his final statements that he made. And these final statements, it's important to know the context of them, because when he said these statements, in some of these statements, it's obvious that they have meaning, and some of them it's not as obvious. He blesses his mother. He tells this prisoner that's next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." He says to his creator, to God Almighty, he says, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? But today we're going to look at the last word that he said, the final word that he said. And fortunately, the last word that Jesus said is the word that gives us our beginning. It's the word that gives us life. It was the word he spoke right before death, and it's the word that today I'm praying will give all of us life in him. We lead up to Easter Sunday with this day that we call Good Friday. And we've all had that thought at some point, this is a bizarre day to call good, right? Because this day was tragic. These men and women that had followed Jesus, that had believed Jesus when he said that the Father and I are one, that I come from the Father, that I am the one who is to come. I am the Messiah. They believed him. They trusted him. But somehow along the way, they missed that he also prophesied his own death and his own resurrection. They missed this. I don't know how. Now looking back, we're like, he says it like 3 different times in the gospel accounts, that they somehow didn't pick up what he was putting down. They caught a lot of other stuff, but they missed that. And so Jesus, getting convicted of being a rebel rouser, of stirring up trouble, he gets put on trial in front of this guy named Pontius Pilate. He's a really interesting character because you could sense that he feels compassion for Jesus. He almost feels sorry for him, that something in him is leaning toward Jesus. And so he's doing everything he can do to try to let him off, because Pontius Pilate even said it. He said, "In him I find no guilt." I can't find anything that this guy has done wrong. And so he follows the Jewish custom. The Jewish custom was to release one of the Jewish prisoners. And so he offers to them. He says, "Hey, all right, let's do this." And maybe thinking, well, the crowd is going to cheer and go for Jesus. And so he offers them Barabbas, a murderer, a gangster, a killer, an assassin, or Jesus, the spotless one, the innocent one. But the crowd chanted, no, we want Barabbas. And so Pilate releases this criminal to them. In doing so, it's really such a remarkable foreshadow, right? That the guilty one goes free and the innocent one takes the punishment. Sound familiar? I mean, how did Jesus feel in that moment? We don't exactly know. The authors of the New Testament, the authors of the gospel, they don't tell us. If it were me, I would be like, are you kidding me? Barabbas over me? This guy is a joke. I mean, I haven't done anything wrong. That's what you would think. That's what I would think. Any rational person would think that. But what we know to be true about Jesus is that Jesus, he loved sinners. And my guess is in that moment, Jesus loved Barabbas. And that little miniature picture of him getting freedom on this earth was a foreshadow of what Jesus was going to do for every single one of us. Take on our guilt and let us go free. And so Pontius Pilate releases Barabbas. He's still going, I don't know what else to do. And so he says, well, let me just order to have him beaten. And so Jesus gets flogged numerous times with this cat of 9 tails that had sharp things tied to the end of it, this leather rope that they beat Jesus senselessly to the point where you could hardly even recognize who he was. They mocked him, they spit on him. He's staying up all night, getting beaten. There's no comfort. Everything just had to be absolutely miserable, and they made the decision to execute him on a Roman cross. Now, this was not the way that they would have sentenced a Jew to death. In the Jewish court system, if someone had done a heinous crime and they sentence a person to death, how would they kill this person? They would stone them. Yeah, that's exactly right. This lady, you want her on your Bible trivia game. She crushed that one. Yeah, they would stone them, right? They would throw stones at them until they breathed their last breath. But Jesus was executed on a Roman cross. This instrument for death that had been perfected in its agony. How do we know that? Well, because the word excruciating. You know what the word excruciating means? From the cross. It was an excruciating death. And after being beaten, Jesus was forced to carry this railroad tie, the cross beam that was going to be hoisted up onto the bar that was buried into the ground. This was hundreds of pounds heavy that they tied his arms to after a couple of days of exhaustion and beatings and whippings. He had to carry it close to a mile, now known as the way of suffering. And somewhere along the way, he just couldn't do it anymore, and he falls to the ground. Now let me ask you, with a railroad tie tied to your back and your arms tied to the railroad tie, when you fall, what's there to brace the fall? Nothing. Your chest, your face. Researchers tell us that blow alone could have killed someone. It's like 70 miles per hour driving directly into a wall with no seatbelt, no airbag. Just a brutal beating, brutal force. Someone volunteers to carry his beam the rest of the way for him. They put a crown of thorns, inch-long thorns, drive it into his head, hoist him up onto this cross. Eventually, he says, "I'm thirsty." They take this hyssop that had to be this disgusting sponge. This is not like a sponge that they just opened up out of the wrapper. No, this is one that they would have used for other things. They would have probably defecated on it. They would have done disgusting things to it, and they dip it in vinegar. Because what does vinegar do to the wounds? It makes them even more painful. I mean, everything about this was so precise, so painful. It was meant for excruciating pain. And they hoist him up onto this cross, nailing his feet into the beams and his wrists being nailed into the cross beam. Some of the most sensitive nerves in all of our body. And there he is, hanging there. You've heard this before, but people that were killed on a cross, they didn't die from the pain. No, how did they die? They died from suffocation. They couldn't breathe. The pain was so great to push up and take a breath. And so when Jesus is at the very end of his journey, in John 19 and verse 30, he tells us this. He says, when he had received the drink, Jesus said, his last word, "It is finished." Tetelestai, the Greek term tetelestai, the tense that he used means it is finished and it is still finished. That definitively, emphatically, obediently, he says, it's over. What is over? What is finished? What is he saying? He's saying that all the effort that we go through, all of the traditions that we have, the good that we try to do to stack up more than our bad, all the religious things that we try to do, the virtues that we try to gain, all the striving and the hustling and the grinding, he's saying, it is finished. You don't have to do all that anymore. It never worked, but it's over. The shame that you carry around, because eventually what happens, and you've seen this with religious people, right? Religious people are oftentimes some of the most shamed people because they know they can't do it. They're being asked to live a certain way. They know they can't do it. And so what do they do when they realize they can't do it? Oftentimes they continue to put on a show and then they go underground. They have secrets. Maybe you do too. In fact, we all do. And those secrets create shame that whispers hopelessness, into any moment of solitude. You'll never be good enough. You're such a fraud. Who do you think you are? They all think you have it together, but we know you're a mess. And all of that shame, it just beats us down. It's exhausting. The guilt that eventually that stacks itself up to condemn us. It's exhausting. All the good we're trying to do, the hustling, the working, the striving, to try to earn our salvation, to try to earn our right standing with God. Jesus says, once and for all, he says, tetelestai. It's finished. Not you're finished. No. Your future's just beginning. It's finished. The processes, the posturing, the striving for perfection, it's finished. It's done. You don't have to do that anymore. It never worked. It's never going to work. And now, once and for all, I'm standing in your place. You don't have to put the little linen, the linen ring upon a goat and send it out into the wilderness anymore. He says in Hebrews, they called Jesus, he's our scapegoat. He's the one who has taken on our sin, taken on our guilt. The theologian Martin Luther comes behind and says, this is the great exchange. This is what Paul is referring to when Paul says, in him who knew no sin, he became sin so that we could become the righteousness of God. People, this is why it was a Good Friday. This is why Easter is the most joyous, joy-filled day of the year, because this is the day where we celebrate that you never could gain your salvation, and all the attempts to earn your salvation are meaningless, that Jesus stands in your place. And all you have to do, no matter where you came from, no matter how bad your weekend was, no matter how bad your year's been, no matter how much debt you have, no matter how many problems you've bumped into, no matter how much pain you've caused other people, all you have to do is put your faith in him. Some of you are like, it's too easy. It can't be that good. No, that's why we call it scandalous grace. That's why we call it amazing grace, because it doesn't even make sense. But this is what he says. He says, it is finished. I have paid the price for you. And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. His last word, it's your beginning. It's my beginning. This makes me so emotional every year to think about the gravity of what we celebrate on Easter. It is exhausting. Y'all know how exhausting it is? It is exhausting. When you feel like you owe someone and you know you can't pay them back. You know what I'm saying? Anybody have that? You feel like you owe somebody. Some of you are in financial debt and it feels exhausting, but some of you are in relational debt. You cheated on someone, you betrayed someone, you hurt someone, and you know you can't come back and change that. I remember feeling this growing up. This is a really silly, trivial example, but when I was growing up, I was a very forgetful child, which is amazing. I'm still a very forgetful adult. And my wonderful parents, we didn't have a lot of money, but they were always trying to buy me the stuff, just to keep up. And I remember going into 10th grade with a new pair of shoes. And I put those new pair of shoes in a bag and went to basketball practice and left them somewhere, and I could not remember where I left them. And when I finally realized where I had left them, I went back to look for them, and they were gone. A week later, my parents, I had to go home and tell them this miserable news. A week later, did the same thing and lost them again. Now, they weren't Reebok pumps, okay? Because I would have probably taken more care of them. That's at least what I told my parents. But it was the third pair of shoes that they had bought me in a month. When I was telling him this story, I was like, I remember feeling like I can never pay you back. I don't have enough money for those shoes. I couldn't go buy myself one, but I need a pair of shoes, and they bought me those. I remember them telling me in the last couple of weeks, well, that wasn't the end of it. This has been your whole life. They said, do you remember when you were in college and you lost a set of bunk beds? And I was like, oh yeah, I do remember that. Some of you were like, okay, the shoes I get, but how do you lose a pair of bunk beds? I don't even know, people. I just remember that feeling of I owe you and I can't pay you back. It's a miserable feeling. Some of you have felt that way with God for a long time, and maybe that's why you've stayed away from him. Maybe you feel it with another person, but I hope today that we get free. I hope today that we get to experience the joy of knowing that your debt is paid. It is finished. You owe no more. You have been set free. You have been forgiven. Grace abounds. God's long arm is surely not too short to save, and his grace is available for you today. John 3:16, you may have heard it. Real simply, he said this. He said, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but should have eternal life. How do you get into heaven? It's not by being good enough. It's not by being more religious. No, it's by putting your faith in Jesus. It's by believing in him. That yes, I'm guilty. That yes, I owe you. That yes, I cannot pay it. And it pains me to say that. But I put my faith in you, the author and the perfecter of my faith. I put my faith in you, the one who hung on that cross and said, it is finished. I put my faith in you. The Apostle Paul, who said, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, he comes back just 7 chapters later in this letter to the Romans. He says, if you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, but not an empty declaration where you're just saying it. He says, no, plus you believe it in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Listen. Today's your day. If you've never put your faith in Jesus, do it today. You can do it from the seat that you're in, but we would love to be able to just talk you through the process, walk you through the process. I can't do it for you. Your mom can't do it for you. Your grandmom can't do it for you. You have to do it within your mouth and your soul and your heart. You have to take your trust and say, everything in me wants to trust in myself. My wealth or lack thereof, my health or lack thereof. I'm taking any other trust and I'm transferring it to him. I'm putting my trust in him, that his death is enough, that he is who he says he is, that he died. And he didn't just die in general, but he died for me. He died for my sin. That brutal death was payment for my sin. But he lives. He's resurrected. And in fact, for me, the reason why I put my trust in Jesus, because anyone who can predict their own death, called his shot, said, I'm going to die and I'm going to resurrect from the dead, and then he pulled it off. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to be wise. You don't have to be a pastor to know you go with the person that can do that. Don't put your faith in him because of me. Put your faith in him because he said, I'm going to die. I'm going to resurrect from the dead. And then he pulled it off. And so today, the invitation is simple. It's life-changing, but it's simple. Would you take your trust today? And would you transfer it from wherever your trust is in? Would you transfer it to him and put the weight of your life in his hands? There's no better place to trust than in him.